A wealthy billionaire believed for years that his young son was completely blind, trusting every word his glamorous fiancée told him about the boy's condition. She always insisted that the child suffered from a serious problem that could never improve, and she controlled every detail of his supposed treatments. The billionaire, overwhelmed by responsibility and grief from the past, accepted her explanations without questioning anything. He thought she was helping him take care of the boy and guiding him through a difficult situation he did not fully understand. Life in the house revolved around these treatments, expensive appointments, and constant worries about the child's health. But everything began to change when the family's longtime maid quietly noticed small details that did not fit the story everyone believed. She observed the child's reactions, the behavior of the fiancé, and the strange routine built around the illness. Day after day, the maid grew more certain that something was wrong. She did not know exactly what the truth was, but she felt that the child's condition might not be what the fiancé claimed. Her instincts told her to pay attention, and little by little, she started uncovering signs that the entire situation was more complicated than it appeared. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. After the death of his wife during childbirth, Richard Hale tried to rebuild the life that had collapsed in a single night. Every morning he woke up feeling the same weight in his chest, but he pushed himself to focus on his newborn son, Ethan. Richard did not know how to balance grief and responsibility, so he followed a simple routine to avoid feeling lost. He cared for Ethan as best as he could, feeding him, holding him, and trying to understand his needs. Still, the house felt empty without his wife, and every room reminded him of what he had lost. To cope, he spent more hours at work, even though it drained him. Being surrounded by people made him feel less alone, and it gave him a break from the quiet of his home. In these early months, Richard's only goal was to keep moving forward, even if he felt like he was walking through fog. His life had changed completely, and he did not know how to return to normal, so he focused on the only thing that made sense, making sure Ethan had the care and attention he deserved. As time passed, Richard began attending more social events, hoping they would distract him from the constant sadness he carried. These gatherings were filled with conversations he barely listened to, but he stayed because they made him feel like he was part of the world again. During one of these events, he met Victoria Barnes, a woman who stood out because of her calm presence and confident behavior. She noticed his struggle even before he tried to hide it. Victoria approached him with gentle curiosity and a willingness to listen, something Richard had not found in anyone else since the tragedy. Their first conversations were simple, but they helped him feel understood. Victoria did not pressure him to act strong or pretend he was fine. Instead, she let him speak at his own pace. Her support slowly became a source of relief. Richard began to look forward to their interactions, not because he sought romance, but because he needed someone who accepted his vulnerability without judgment. That small connection made him feel less alone for the first time in months. As they continued to meet, Richard allowed Victoria to step closer into his personal life. He did not plan it, but her presence naturally filled the empty spaces his grief had created. She visited him more often, sometimes just to check on Ethan, or to bring small comforts that made daily life easier. Richard noticed how she seemed to understand the routine he was trying so hard to maintain. She offered advice and simple suggestions that made tasks feel less overwhelming. Over time, he started depending on her guidance, trusting her judgment when he felt unsure. Victoria never pushed her way in. She always waited for him to open the door, and he did, again and again. Her calm voice and steady behavior made the difficult days feel more manageable. Though he still carried the pain of losing his wife, he found moments of stability when Victoria was around. She became part of his daily environment without him realizing how much space he had given her. Richard knew he was still fragile, but he appreciated having someone who helped him stay grounded when his emotions threatened to take over. While Richard navigated his changing feelings, Ethan continued to grow quietly. He was a calm child who rarely cried, but there was something different about him that Richard could not fully understand. Ethan often struggled to focus his eyes on objects or people. Sometimes he would reach towards something and miss by several inches. These small signs worried Richard, but he did not know what they meant. He tried to convince himself that Ethan would grow out of it, that every child developed at their own pace. Still, the uncertainty lingered. Whenever Richard mentioned these concerns, Victoria always responded with confidence. She told him not to worry, to trust the process, and to keep observing Ethan. Her reassurance eased his mind, even though he still felt unsettled. Richard wanted to be the kind of father who understood everything his son needed, but he often felt unprepared. Watching Ethan struggle, even in small ways, reminded him how vulnerable their new life was. He hoped he was doing enough, even on days when he doubted every decision. As Victoria became more involved, her guidance shifted from simple suggestions to a more active role in the household. Richard, exhausted from balancing work, grief and fatherhood, accepted her help easily. She organized routines, planned daily tasks, and offered opinions about Ethan's care. Whenever Richard hesitated, she stepped in with certainty, making choices that he followed without question. Her confidence made him feel safe, as if someone finally understood the family he was trying to rebuild. He believed that trusting her was the best decision he could make for Ethan. Victoria's influence grew naturally, and Richard did not resist it. He felt grateful for every moment she spent by his side, helping him navigate responsibilities he once feared he could not handle alone. Even when something felt unfamiliar, he accepted her reasoning because he believed she wanted the best for them. The house, once filled with silence and uncertainty, now had structure again. Richard saw this change as a sign that healing might finally be possible. Despite the progress in Richard's life, a quiet tension remained around Ethan's unexplained struggles. His visual difficulties did not improve as quickly as Richard hoped. Sometimes Ethan stared into empty spaces, as if trying to make sense of shapes he could not fully see. Richard counted each small challenge, unsure if he was reading too much into it or not enough. Still, he relied heavily on Victoria's reassurance. Whenever doubt grew in his mind, she reminded him that children develop differently and that his worry would only exhaust him further. Richard clung to her words because he needed someone to guide him through the confusion. He wanted to believe that everything was unfolding the way it should. As each day passed, Ethan continued to grow, quiet and observant, while Richard struggled to balance hope and fear. He did not know what the future would bring, but he trusted Victoria's presence to keep their lives steady. For now, that was enough for him, even if a part of him still longed for answers he did not yet have. When Ethan turned 3 years old, life inside the house began to change again. Richard tried to keep everything organized, but the household felt different now that Ethan was older and needed more attention. Around this time, Margaret Cooper returned to work for the family. She had been the trusted employee who worked closely with Richard's late wife, and her presence brought a sense of familiarity back into the home. As soon as she came back, Margaret quietly resumed her usual responsibilities. She knew the routines well and understood how the house used to function before the tragedy. She watched Ethan carefully, trying to understand how he was developing. She also paid close attention to the new environment created by Victoria, who now had a strong influence in the household. Margaret did not want to disrupt anything, but she observed every detail with the calm awareness she had gained from years of experience. Her return made the home feel more complete, though there was also a new tension she sensed but could not yet explain. Still, Margaret focused on doing her job, hoping she could support Richard and Ethan in this new stage of their lives. As Margaret settled back into her position, she began to notice things about Victoria that made her uneasy. Victoria acted confident and kept control over many parts of the household, but she behaved differently whenever Margaret was nearby. Margaret tried to stay polite and respectful, but she sensed that Victoria did not fully welcome her return. She often caught Victoria watching her with a guarded expression, as if she felt threatened or annoyed by Margaret's presence. Despite this, Margaret did not allow the tension to affect her work. She focused on Ethan, who needed constant care and patience. The boy struggled to respond to visual cues, and Margaret observed how he often missed objects placed right in front of him. His eyes seemed sensitive, sometimes watering for reasons she could not understand. Margaret had been around children for years, but Ethan's reactions felt more intense and persistent. She grew concerned and paid even closer attention, trying to understand what might be causing his discomfort. Even while feeling unwelcome by Victoria, she stayed committed to helping Ethan as best as she could. The more time Margaret spent in the house, the more she noticed Victoria's subtle but constant vigilance. Victoria rarely spoke to her unless necessary, and when she did, her tone felt sharp or cold. Margaret tried to ignore it, but she could not deny that something about Victoria's attitude seemed off. She carried herself with confidence and authority, but she also seemed irritated whenever Margaret offered suggestions based on her experience with the Hale family. Margaret felt that Victoria wanted complete control of the household and saw her return as an intrusion. Still, Margaret remained patient and focused on her tasks. She cared for Ethan in small, steady ways, helping him eat, guiding him through daily activities, and observing his reactions to the world around him. Each day revealed more signs that Ethan struggled with his vision. Sometimes he would reach toward a sound instead of a sight, and other times he would blink rapidly, as if trying to clear his eyes. Margaret tried to understand whether this was simply part of his development or something more serious. Her concern grew slowly, forming a quiet worry she carried every day while she worked. One particular concern Margaret could not ignore involved the eye drops Victoria regularly applied to Ethan. She often saw Victoria using them without any clear explanation or instruction from a doctor. Margaret found this suspicious, especially because she had never heard Richard mention any medical guidance about it. Each time the drops were used, Ethan reacted with discomfort. His eyes would redden, and he sometimes rubbed them as if they burned. Margaret tried to stay calm when she noticed these reactions, but inside she felt alarmed. She knew she needed to be cautious with her observations because Victoria already seemed defensive around her. Still, the pattern troubled her deeply. She tried to watch discreetly, hoping to understand why Ethan was reacting so strongly. Margaret wondered if the drops were truly necessary or if they were causing more harm than help. She felt powerless to address it directly, but she made sure to be present whenever she could, especially when Ethan needed comforting after each application. Her protective instincts grew stronger, reminding her of the time she had spent with Ethan's mother and the trust she had earned from the Hale family over the years. As days turned into weeks, Margaret's concern for Ethan only increased. She noticed small changes in his mood after each dose of the eye drops. He became quieter, sometimes clinging to her when she carried him through the house. Margaret could see that the discomfort affected him emotionally, not just physically. She wanted to comfort him, but she also knew she needed to respect the boundaries set by Richard and Victoria. Still, she continued to observe everything with care. She watched how Victoria handled the child, how she justified the treatments, and how she dismissed any signs of pain Ethan showed. Margaret felt frustrated, but remained cautious. She did not want to create conflict, especially because Richard seemed to trust Victoria completely. Margaret's long history with the family made her feel responsible for protecting Ethan, yet she could only do so much without bringing attention to the tension already growing within the household. She hoped that with time she could find a way to address her concerns without worsening the atmosphere. Eventually, Margaret realized that Victoria's distant behavior toward her had grown into something more clearly hostile. Victoria avoided speaking to her unless absolutely necessary and rarely looked her in the eye. When they passed each other in the hall, Victoria's expression often carried irritation or distrust. Margaret sensed that Victoria felt threatened by her knowledge of the family's past and her connection to Richard's late wife. Yet Margaret had no intention of replacing anyone or creating conflict. She simply wanted to care for Ethan and support the household, as she always had. Despite Victoria's attitude, Margaret stayed steady and respectful. She kept doing her work with the same dedication she had before her absence. She watched Ethan carefully, noting every reaction and change in his behavior, especially the irritation in his eyes. Even though the tension in the house was becoming more obvious, Margaret remained focused on what mattered most, making sure Ethan felt safe and cared for in a home that had become increasingly complicated since Victoria's arrival. Victoria began taking full control of everything related to Ethan's supposed treatments. She organized the schedules, ordered the products, and managed every step without asking for help. She presented Richard with several imported eye drops, private appointments, and new medical expenses that grew larger each month. Richard accepted everything without questioning her. He believed that Victoria knew what she was doing and trusted her judgment completely. Whenever she explained that Ethan had a chance to recover part of his vision if they followed the process exactly as she described, Richard listened with hope. He wanted to believe there was a way to help his son, and Victoria used that hope to justify every new cost. Meanwhile, Ethan struggled more after each application of the drops. His reactions became stronger, and he often turned his face away from any light. His sensitivity grew so much that he sometimes refused to open his eyes. Richard noticed these changes, but believed they were part of the treatment. Victoria always reinforced that discomfort was expected and that progress required patience. Richard accepted her explanations because he feared losing the chance to help Ethan improve. As the weeks passed, Ethan's reaction to the treatments became even more noticeable. After each dose, he showed signs of pain, rubbing his eyes or holding tightly onto whoever carried him. Margaret watched these reactions with growing worry. She paid close attention to the bottles that Victoria used. Some had labels written in languages she did not recognize, while others had no clear origin at all. The packaging looked unusual, and the information printed on them did not match anything she had seen in common medical products. Margaret found this suspicious, especially when she compared the high costs Victoria mentioned with the simple appearance of the containers. She wanted to ask questions, but she knew Victoria would not welcome them. Instead, she observed silently, trying to understand what was really happening. Richard never questioned the authenticity of the treatments because he trusted Victoria completely. To him, every new bill represented another chance for Ethan to get better. Margaret, however, grew more uneasy with each passing day as she saw how much Ethan suffered. Victoria continued handling the medical expenses as if she were managing an important project. She kept detailed lists of payments, receipts, and scheduled visits, always showing them to Richard with confidence. Richard interpreted her behavior as dedication. He felt grateful that she was willing to invest time and effort into helping his son. What he did not see was how the expenses increased without clear explanation. Victoria often mentioned high costs for imported products, special exams, or private consultations. She traveled frequently, saying the trips were necessary to acquire new treatments or meet specialists. Richard accepted all of it because he believed the results depended on following her instructions closely. He never suspected that Victoria's organization was more about maintaining an appearance of efficiency than about helping Ethan. Margaret, who saw everything up close, noticed how the receipts piled up and how Victoria guarded them carefully. She sensed that the situation was not as transparent as it appeared, but she also understood that questioning Victoria directly would only create more tension. The relationship between Victoria and Margaret grew heavier with each passing day. Margaret remained polite and focused on her work, but she could feel Victoria's disapproval every time their paths crossed. Victoria avoided speaking to her unless it was strictly necessary, and even then, her tone was cold. Margaret recognized this behavior as a clear attempt to exclude her from anything related to Ethan's treatments. She felt pushed aside, even though she had known the family long before Victoria entered their lives. Despite the tension, Margaret continued caring for Ethan with the same dedication as always. She paid attention to his reactions, his discomfort, and the way his eyes seemed to worsen instead of improve. She tried to stay calm, but the growing distance between her and Victoria made her feel powerless. She wanted to protect Ethan, yet she had no authority to question the decisions Victoria made. Still, she silently monitored everything, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. Richard tried to stay positive, convinced that Victoria was guiding them in the right direction. He did not notice the silent conflict between the two women because he was focused on Ethan's future. Whenever Victoria explained the next step in the treatment, he accepted it without hesitation. His hope made him ignore the signs that something was wrong. He saw Ethan's discomfort as temporary and believed that the long-term benefits were worth it. Richard's trust in Victoria grew stronger every day, leaving little room for doubt. He worked harder to cover the increasing expenses and reassured himself that sacrifice was necessary when it came to his son's health. Margaret watched him with sympathy, knowing he acted out of love, but she wished he could see what she saw. The tension continued to build, but no one addressed it openly. The house functioned under a quiet strain, with Richard trying to stay hopeful, Victoria pushing her plans forward, and Margaret observing everything in silence. As time went on, the atmosphere in the house became heavier. Victoria's control over Ethan's treatments remained firm, and she continued presenting new expenses as essential steps in the recovery process. Richard followed her guidance without questioning anything. Ethan's condition, however, did not show signs of improvement. His eyes grew more sensitive, and his pain became harder to ignore. Margaret watched this with growing fear, realizing that something was very wrong. She studied each bottle Victoria used, trying to find clues about their contents, but the labels offered no answers. The tension between her and Victoria reached a point where neither trusted the other, although they never confronted each other directly. Margaret stayed quiet because she knew that one wrong step could push her out of the house completely, and then Ethan would have no one to watch over him. Victoria continued acting with confidence, organizing bills, trips, and treatments, while hiding her intentions behind a mask of efficiency. Richard, hopeful and unaware of the conflict around him, believed he was doing everything possible for his son. The quiet struggle continued, shaping each day with worry, suspicion, and unspoken fears. Margaret began noticing important differences in Ethan's behavior on days when the eye drops were not used. On those days, he seemed calmer and more comfortable. He rubbed his eyes less often and did not show the same level of irritation that had become common after each application. This pattern slowly became clear to her as she compared his reactions from one day to the next. She watched carefully every morning and afternoon, trying to see whether there was any chance she was mistaken, but the contrast was too obvious. Whenever Victoria skipped the drops for any reason, Ethan behaved more peacefully. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and worry as she realized this. Relief because it meant Ethan could feel better without the drops. Worry because it raised serious questions about what the substance actually did to him. She did not want to jump to conclusions, but she knew she had to pay attention. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that something was wrong. Yet she also knew how much Richard trusted Victoria, which made Margaret cautious about how she approached the situation. One quiet afternoon, Margaret discovered something that concerned her deeply. She found one of the small bottles Victoria had discarded. It was left near a trash bin, slightly hidden under other items, almost as if someone attempted to get rid of it quickly. Margaret picked it up and looked at it closely. The label was unclear, and many details were either missing or unreadable. She examined the container from all sides, trying to understand what kind of product it was supposed to be. What she saw did not match the descriptions Victoria had given Richard. The writing on the bottle did not resemble the information from legitimate medical products she had seen before. This discovery made Margaret feel uneasy, but it also confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in her mind. She held the bottle for a long moment, trying to decide what to do next. She knew that this was important evidence, but she also realized that approaching the issue in the wrong way could create more problems than solutions. Unsure of how to handle the situation alone, Margaret decided to speak to Richard. She hoped that he would listen, at least long enough to consider the possibility that something was wrong. She chose her words carefully when she approached him, explaining what she had noticed about Ethan's reactions and the strange bottle she had found. Margaret did not accuse Victoria directly. She only shared the facts as she had observed them. However, Richard reacted in a way she did not expect. He became distant and cold, as if her concerns were an attack rather than an attempt to protect Ethan. He insisted that Victoria was acting under medical guidance and that all treatments had professional approval. He dismissed Margaret's observations as misunderstandings and told her that unfounded criticism would not be tolerated. His response left her shocked and disappointed. She had hoped he would at least take her concerns seriously, but instead he defended Victoria without hesitation. Margaret realized that Richard's trust in Victoria was unshakable, at least for now. Feeling misunderstood and unsupported, Margaret grew more determined to find out the truth. She knew she could not rely on Richard to question Victoria's actions, so she had to approach the situation differently. Margaret began writing down everything she saw. She created a small notebook where she recorded times, behaviors, reactions, and anything unusual that happened around Ethan's treatments. She documented every moment when the drops were applied and how Ethan behaved afterward. She also wrote about the days without treatment, noting how much calmer and more comfortable he seemed. Margaret paid close attention to Victoria's routines, tracking when she handled the bottles or organized new supplies. Her detailed notes became a way to prove that what she observed was real and consistent. She did all of this quietly, making sure Victoria never noticed. Margaret felt isolated, but she refused to ignore what she believed could be harming Ethan. As she continued her careful observations, Margaret started analyzing the situation more deeply. She thought about every possible explanation for Ethan's condition. Was his sensitivity truly natural, or was something influencing it? She replayed memories of his behavior during different times of the day, comparing his reactions in each situation. She remembered small details, like how he blinked rapidly only after certain applications, or how he relaxed more easily on untreated days. The more she compared, the clearer the pattern became. Margaret felt a growing responsibility to uncover the truth, especially because she feared that Ethan's condition might not be improving, but worsening. She did not want to believe that something harmful was happening under the same roof where she lived and worked, yet the evidence around her pointed her in that direction. Her mind filled with questions she could not yet answer, but she refused to look away. Margaret slowly shifted into a quiet investigation mode, watching everything from the background. She avoided drawing attention to herself, and she performed her daily tasks with the same patience as always. But inside, she was alert to every detail. She studied the bottles, the routines, and the way Victoria managed the household. Margaret knew she needed to continue gathering information before taking any further steps. She hoped that by documenting everything, she could eventually present facts strong enough that Richard would have no choice but to see the truth. The situation made her feel tense and alone, but she stayed focused. Each new observation strengthened her belief that Ethan's suffering might be connected to something happening regularly inside the house. Margaret was determined to protect him, even if she had to do it quietly and carefully for as long as necessary. Margaret became even more determined to understand what was happening inside the house. She continued observing everything carefully, but now she began collecting concrete evidence. She took photographs of the bottles Victoria used, making sure to capture every angle of the labels and the strange markings she had noticed before. She also kept the empty packaging Victoria discarded, storing them in a safe place where no one would find them. In addition, she wrote down the dates of purchases and deliveries that Victoria handled, comparing them with the receipts she occasionally glimpsed. The numbers did not make sense. The values were too high, and some of the substances listed did not match the products Margaret saw. Every new detail strengthened her concern. She worked with caution, aware that any mistake could expose her. Margaret's goal was not to create conflict, it was to protect Ethan. Each piece of information she gathered made her believe even more that something was terribly wrong. She planned her steps carefully and kept all her findings organized, hoping that one day she could prove what she had been suspecting. During one of her quiet searches, Margaret made a discovery that shocked her. While Victoria was distracted, she checked the woman's bag, looking only for clues related to Ethan's treatment. Inside, she found documents that raised new alarms. There were repeated receipts, as if the same expenses were being used more than once. She also found medical prescriptions that looked suspicious. The signatures did not match, and some papers seemed to have been copied or altered. Margaret studied each document briefly, taking mental notes before placing everything back exactly as she had found it. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the seriousness of her discovery. These papers suggested that Victoria had been manipulating information, expenses, or medical records. Margaret knew she needed to be careful. If Victoria realized what she knew, the situation could escalate quickly. Still, she could not ignore what she had seen. The documents added even more weight to her growing fear that Ethan's condition was being influenced by something other than a natural problem. Feeling that she could not stay silent anymore, Margaret tried confronting Victoria in a subtle way. She chose her words carefully, hoping to prompt Victoria into giving some sort of explanation. Instead of answering calmly, Victoria reacted with hostility. Her tone became sharp, and her expression filled with anger. She accused Margaret of invading her privacy and overstepping boundaries. Victoria made it clear that questioning her actions was unacceptable. She even hinted that Margaret could lose her job if she continued interfering. These threats were not shouted, but the message was unmistakable. Margaret stood quietly, trying not to show fear. She realized Victoria wanted to intimidate her into silence. The conversation made it obvious that Victoria was hiding something and would do anything to protect her control over the situation. Margaret walked away from the confrontation more convinced than ever that she needed to continue investigating. But now she had to be even more careful. Victoria's reaction was a clear warning that she did not intend to be questioned by anyone. Not long after the confrontation, Victoria spoke to Richard and told him her version of what had happened. She described Margaret's actions as disrespectful and disloyal, framing the situation as an act of insubordination. When Richard heard this, he called Margaret and reprimanded her. His tone was stern, and he expressed disappointment in her behavior. He repeated what Victoria had told him, insisting that Margaret had crossed a line by questioning the treatments and invading privacy. Margaret tried to explain, but her words seemed to make no difference. Richard defended Victoria and claimed that her decisions were supported by medical professionals. This moment widened the distance between Margaret and Richard even more. She felt misunderstood and alone, but she refused to give up. She knew she could not rely on Richard to see the truth right away, especially with Victoria influencing his every perception. Instead, she accepted the reprimand quietly and continued her work, knowing that confronting him further would only push him farther away. Despite the threats and the reprimand, Margaret remained firm in her mission. She believed that the truth mattered more than her own comfort or safety. Determined to obtain proof that could not be ignored, she took some of the eye drop samples she had secretly saved and brought them to a small clinic in the city. She chose a discreet place, one where no one from the Hale household would likely go. She explained only what was necessary, asking for a chemical analysis of the substance. Her hope was that the results would reveal whether the drops were safe or harmful. The decision to take this step felt heavy, but she knew it was the only way to move forward. If the substance was causing Ethan's continued blindness or increasing his pain, she needed evidence strong enough to be undeniable. Margaret left the clinic with a mixture of fear and relief, aware that she had now started a process that could change everything. While waiting for the results, Margaret continued her routine in the house as if nothing had happened. She cared for Ethan with the same gentle patience as always, but inside she felt the weight of her secret actions. She watched Victoria closely, noting every detail of her behavior and every moment she handled the treatments. Margaret no longer questioned whether something was wrong. She was convinced of it. Now she just needed confirmation. The tension in the house remained high, and the distance between her and Victoria had become clearer than ever. Richard continued trusting Victoria completely, unaware of the quiet investigation happening under his roof. Margaret carried on, determined to protect Ethan no matter how difficult the situation became. She knew she had taken a risky step by involving the clinic, but she felt that it was the only way to finally reveal what was truly affecting the child's vision and well-being. Margaret finally received the results from the clinic, and what she read left her deeply disturbed. The analysis showed that the eye drops contained irritating substances with no therapeutic benefit. Instead of helping Ethan, the product could worsen any existing eye condition. The report explained that the ingredients caused inflammation and sensitivity, which matched the reactions Margaret had been observing for months. She held the papers in her hands, feeling both relief for having confirmation and fear for what this meant for the child. She knew now that the treatment Victoria insisted on was not only useless, but also harmful. Margaret spent a long time thinking about every moment Ethan had cried or rubbed his eyes after the applications, realizing that each reaction had not been part of a healing process, but a sign of damage. The evidence made her feel even more responsible to act. But she also understood that this step put her in a more dangerous position inside the household. Still, she could not ignore the truth. She needed to continue, no matter how difficult it became. With the analysis results in hand, Margaret decided to study Ethan's past medical records. She searched through old documents stored in the house, hoping to find answers about his real condition. After some time, she discovered detailed reports written shortly after his birth. These records explained that Ethan was born with a rare visual impairment. The condition affected his ability to focus and respond normally to visual stimuli, but it was not described as completely irreversible. The documents outlined possible treatment options and indicated that early and appropriate care could help improve his vision over time. Margaret read each page carefully, comparing the medical recommendations with what Victoria had been doing. The continuous use of the irritating eye drops directly contradicted everything listed in the reports. The notes suggested gentle care and professional supervision, not the harsh treatments Victoria enforced. Margaret felt her frustration grow as she pieced together the situation. Ethan had a chance to improve, but that chance was being blocked by harmful practices disguised as advanced medical help. While Margaret worked quietly with the documents, Victoria continued to demand more payments from Richard. She insisted that new and expensive treatments were necessary for Ethan's progress. According to her, specialists required advanced examinations, imported medicines, and follow-up visits that could not be delayed. Richard, trusting her completely, approved every request. He believed that the growing expenses meant they were getting closer to helping Ethan recover. Margaret watched this unfold with concern, realizing that Victoria had created a cycle of ongoing payments and false hope. Every time Richard hesitated, Victoria reassured him with confident explanations and claims of medical necessity. Margaret understood that until she could show undeniable evidence, Richard would continue obeying Victoria's guidance without question. It was painful to see him invest so much trust and money into something harmful. Margaret wished she could break through the barrier Victoria had built, but for the moment, all she could do was continue gathering facts and preparing herself for the right moment to speak again. Determined to find someone who would take the situation seriously, Margaret reached out to the family's former pediatrician. She knew this doctor had cared for Ethan in his early days and trusted her professional judgment. When Margaret explained what she had discovered and shared the analysis results, the pediatrician reacted with clear concern. She reviewed the old medical records alongside the new information and confirmed that the substances in the eye drops were incompatible with Ethan's condition. The pediatrician stated that such irritants could worsen the rare impairment he had been born with, making any chance of improvement smaller. She also explained that proper treatment should focus on reducing irritation, not increasing it. Hearing this confirmation strengthened Margaret's resolve. She finally had a medical opinion that matched her fears. The pediatrician encouraged her to continue documenting everything, knowing the situation was serious. Margaret left the meeting feeling supported, though she also understood that bringing this truth into the Hale household would be extremely difficult. Even though Margaret now carried undeniable proof, she faced resistance from almost everyone around her. Whenever she tried to raise concerns, she was dismissed or ignored. Richard, still influenced by Victoria, insisted that the treatments were guided by professionals and that Margaret's interference was harmful. Other people connected to the household viewed her as someone trying to create conflict. They believed Victoria's explanations more easily than Margaret's warnings. This left her feeling isolated, but she refused to let the pressure stop her. She knew that what she had discovered was real, and she could not allow Ethan's suffering to continue unchecked. Each rejection made her more determined to protect him. She continued organizing her documents, keeping every piece of evidence ready for the moment she would need to use it. Even if no one listened now, Margaret believed that the truth would eventually become impossible to deny. Margaret returned to her daily routine, but now with a clearer purpose. She watched Ethan carefully, noticing again and again how the irritation increased after each application of the harmful eye drops. She kept updating her notes with every new reaction and every suspicious action taken by Victoria. She felt the weight of being the only person truly aware of the danger Ethan faced. The silence inside the home grew heavier, filled with tension and unspoken doubts. Margaret reminded herself that she was not acting out of anger or distrust, but out of genuine concern for the child she had cared for since his birth. She knew that standing alone was difficult, but she also understood that giving up was not an option. As she continued gathering information, she hoped that soon the evidence would become strong enough to break through the resistance surrounding her, forcing Richard and everyone else to finally see what was really harming the boy. Victoria soon realized that Margaret was not just suspicious, but actively watching every detail of Ethan's treatment. This discovery made her change her behavior quickly. She began controlling access to Ethan in a strict and obvious way. Margaret was no longer allowed to stay alone with the boy, even during simple daily routines. Victoria always found a reason to be present, interrupt, or take over whenever Margaret approached him. These limits were presented as concern, but Margaret could clearly see they were meant to keep her away. At the same time, Victoria increased the frequency of the eye drop applications. She claimed Ethan needed more consistent treatment, using this as justification for new expenses and purchases. Margaret watched helplessly as the harmful drops were used even more than before. She noticed Ethan becoming more uncomfortable and sensitive after each application, which only increased her worry. Even though she had proof that the treatment was dangerous, she could not stop Victoria from tightening her control. The situation grew more intense, and Margaret realized that Victoria now saw her as a direct threat. Richard reacted to all of this by siding completely with Victoria. He believed her behavior demonstrated strong commitment and responsibility toward Ethan's well-being. When Victoria insisted that the restrictions were necessary, Richard accepted them without hesitation. He reinforced these limits by telling Margaret to respect Victoria's decisions and avoid questioning them. Richard was emotionally dependent on the structure Victoria created, seeing her as the one person who kept the household stable. He trusted her judgment more than his own, especially when she spoke confidently about medical needs and treatments. Margaret felt her connection to Richard slipping away entirely. Any attempt she made to raise concerns was dismissed before she could fully speak. Richard saw her comments as unnecessary interruptions, shaped by misunderstanding rather than genuine care. This created a growing distance between them and deepened Margaret's sense of isolation within the home. She felt powerless, but refused to give up her responsibility toward Ethan. The atmosphere in the house became heavier when Victoria took the conflict to the next level. During a particularly tense moment, she accused Margaret of being negligent with Ethan. Victoria claimed that the boy's condition worsened after spending time under Margaret's care. She used small incidents and misinterpreted observations to support her accusations. Her words were sharp and aimed at destroying Margaret's credibility. Richard, already convinced of Victoria's authority, accepted these accusations as truth. He believed Margaret was failing in her duties, and this belief made him even more distant. Margaret could see how carefully Victoria crafted her accusations, shaping them to influence Richard's emotions. The accusation hurt Margaret deeply, because she knew how much she cared for Ethan and how hard she had worked to understand his condition. Still, she remained quiet, realizing that arguing with Victoria would only worsen the situation. Her priority was Ethan, not defending herself in front of someone who had no interest in the truth. As the accusations settled into Richard's mind, the household shifted into a place of constant hostility. Victoria moved through the rooms with authority, using her influence to control nearly every decision. Richard followed her guidance without questioning her motives. Ethan, unaware of the conflict around him, continued to suffer the effects of the increased treatments. Margaret watched the situation unfold with a sinking feeling. She felt trapped in a home where her presence was no longer trusted, and yet she could not bring herself to leave. Ethan needed her more than ever, and the more Victoria tried to push her aside, the stronger Margaret's determination became. Every day brought a new level of tension. Victoria's comments became colder, Richard's trust faded further, and Margaret felt the weight of being alone in her efforts. But despite the pressure, she refused to stop searching for ways to reveal the truth. Richard's dependence on Victoria's guidance grew until it defined every decision he made. He had become convinced that Victoria provided the structure, calmness, and stability he needed to navigate his life after so much loss. This made him blind to the warning signs surrounding her behavior. When Victoria spoke, he listened. When she expressed concern, he accepted it as fact. Margaret could see how deeply his emotions shaped his judgment. She understood that Victoria had filled the emotional void left by tragedy, but she also knew that this attachment made him vulnerable to manipulation. Richard no longer questioned Victoria's intentions or the treatments she insisted on. This blind trust created a barrier that Margaret could not break through, no matter how much evidence she collected. She knew that convincing him would require more than words. It would require undeniable proof presented at the right moment, proof he could not ignore. Margaret continued gathering documents and organizing every piece of evidence she had collected over time. She reviewed the analysis results, medical records, suspicious receipts, and the notes she had written daily. Each item added to a growing collection that clearly showed a pattern of harm and manipulation. Despite being isolated and treated with distrust, Margaret focused on her mission. She felt the urgency rising inside her. Ethan's condition was worsening because of the increased applications, and Victoria had full control over every moment of his routine. Margaret realized that if she hesitated, the situation could become irreversible. She knew the risk she carried, especially with Victoria watching her closely and Richard doubting her loyalty. Still, she refused to stop. She continued documenting every detail, holding on to the hope that soon she would find a way to expose the truth and protect Ethan before it was too late. Margaret reached a turning point when she managed to recover a video from the internal cameras of the house. She had been checking old recordings quietly, hoping to find something that could help her prove what she had been seeing for months. After hours of searching, she finally found a file that had not been deleted or altered. In the video, Victoria was applying the eye drops to Ethan while he cried uncontrollably. Even though he could not see well, he moved his head away repeatedly, trying to escape. His cries were not simple complaints. They showed clear pain and fear. Margaret watched the recording with a heavy feeling in her chest. Seeing Ethan suffer confirmed everything she had suspected. The images were strong enough to prove that the treatment was not helping him at all. With this video in her hands, she felt a new sense of responsibility. This was no longer only about suspicion or careful notes. Now she had undeniable evidence of what was happening behind closed doors. Margaret knew this was the proof she needed to finally take action, even if the situation felt frightening. After recovering the video, Margaret gathered all the other documents she had collected over time. She reviewed the medical reports, the analysis confirming harmful substances in the eye drops, the suspicious receipts, and the falsified prescriptions she had found earlier. She combined these materials with the video, arranging everything into a complete and organized dossier. She included dates, descriptions, and explanations for each piece of evidence. Margaret also added details showing how the financial scheme had been built. She pointed out the repeated expenses, the exaggerated prices, and the lack of professional medical support behind the treatments Victoria claimed were necessary. As she prepared the dossier, she felt both nervous and confident. She knew that once Richard saw the full picture, he would not be able to deny the truth. Each document she added strengthened her belief that Victoria had been manipulating the family for years. Margaret had worked silently for a long time, and now she had everything she needed to expose the reality of the situation. With the dossier ready, Margaret waited for the right moment to talk to Richard. She chose a morning when the house was quiet and Victoria was not nearby. Margaret walked to his office with the documents held firmly in her hands. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. When she entered, Richard looked at her with caution, still influenced by Victoria's accusations. Margaret gently placed the folder on his desk and asked him to listen before reacting. She explained that what she had to show him was important and that it involved Ethan's health and safety. Richard hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. But something in Margaret's expression made him agree to review the material. She opened the dossier and walked him through each part. She spoke slowly and clearly, describing how she had found each document and why she had started investigating. Richard did not say anything at first. He simply watched as Margaret unfolded the truth piece by piece. At the beginning, Richard struggled to believe what he was seeing. The video shocked him the most, watching Ethan cry and twist in pain while Victoria forced the drops into his eyes made him feel physically sick. He replayed the scene several times, hoping he had misunderstood something, but the truth was in front of him, undeniable and painful. As he moved through the receipts and bank transfers, his disbelief shifted into confusion. The amounts were extremely high, much more than he remembered approving. Margaret showed him how payments had been repeated, redirected, or disguised as medical expenses. She connected each financial record to accounts linked to Victoria. Richard felt the ground beneath him shift. He had trusted Victoria completely, believing every word she said. Now the numbers showed a pattern of deception he could no longer ignore. Slowly, his certainty began to crumble. He realized that the situation was not a misunderstanding, but a carefully constructed manipulation that had lasted for years. Margaret continued explaining each part of the dossier with patience. She reminded Richard of the old medical records she had found in the house, showing Ethan's real diagnosis and the treatments recommended by the specialists who had cared for him as a newborn. She compared those records with the harmful substances found in the eye drops Victoria insisted on using. When Margaret showed him the analysis proving that the drops had no therapeutic effect and could worsen Ethan's condition, Richard felt overwhelmed. He held the papers tightly, reading the medical explanations again and again. Margaret described the many times Ethan reacted better on days without treatment, the suspicious behavior she had observed, and the documents that had clearly been altered. Her voice remained calm, even though she knew this moment could change everything. Richard listened without interrupting, trying to understand how he had missed so many signs. Little by little, the truth began to make sense. As Richard examined the final pages of the dossier, the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. He saw the transfers to Victoria's accounts, the repeated invoices with no medical justification, and the proofs of falsified prescriptions. Each new discovery hit him harder than the last. He realized he had allowed Victoria to gain complete control over his decisions by using his fear and hope as tools. The thought that Ethan had been suffering because of his misplaced trust was almost unbearable. Margaret stood quietly nearby, giving him the space he needed to process everything. She had prepared herself for disbelief or anger, but now Richard's silence showed that the truth was reaching him. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. He lowered the document slowly, still trying to understand how someone he trusted so deeply could have caused so much harm. Margaret remained steady, knowing this was only the beginning of what needed to be resolved, but also feeling that this was the moment the truth finally began to break through. Richard, now fully aware of the truth, decided that he could not wait another minute. He asked Victoria to meet him in the main room of the house, choosing a place where there would be no interruptions or excuses. When she arrived, she immediately noticed his serious expression. She tried to greet him normally, but Richard did not respond. Instead, he placed the folder Margaret had prepared on the table between them. Victoria looked at it with confusion at first, but her face slowly changed as she recognized some of the documents. Richard told her that he had reviewed everything and understood what had been happening for years. He spoke with a steady voice, explaining that the evidence showed a clear pattern of manipulation, financial fraud, and harm toward Ethan. Victoria tried to interrupt him several times, insisting that the documents were misunderstandings or attempts to make her look guilty. But Richard did not allow her to explain. All the trust he once had in her was gone, replaced by pain and disbelief. Realizing she was cornered, Victoria began to shift her strategy. She tried to defend herself by saying she only wanted to help the family. She argued that Margaret had always been jealous and was trying to destroy their relationship out of spite. She claimed that the video, the analysis, and the receipts were being twisted to make her appear responsible for something she never intended. Her words became more desperate as she spoke, trying to regain control of the situation. She insisted that Richard was overreacting and that all the treatments she organized were attempts to give Ethan a better future. But Richard remained firm. He had heard enough lies and excuses. He repeated that the evidence showed no misunderstanding, only deliberate actions. For the first time, Victoria understood that Richard would not be manipulated again. Her confidence faded, replaced by visible fear, as she realized there was no escape from the truth that had been laid in front of her. Richard began presenting each piece of evidence in order, so she could not deny or twist anything. He showed her the financial transactions that went directly to accounts connected to her, pointing out how they had no link to real medical treatments. He showed her the falsified prescriptions and the inconsistent receipts with repeated values. Then he played the video in which she applied the eye drops to Ethan while he cried in pain. Victoria tried to look away, but Richard forced her to face the screen. He reminded her of every moment he had trusted her, every decision he had allowed her to make, and how she had used that trust to manipulate him emotionally. Richard spoke clearly, explaining how each document matched Margaret's reports and the medical analysis. Victoria tried to deny the accusations again, but her voice grew weaker as each detail exposed the truth. She realized that her explanations would no longer convince him, not when the facts were so solid and complete. As the confrontation escalated, Richard made the decision he had been building toward since Margaret revealed everything. Without raising his voice or hesitating, he took out his phone and called the authorities. He explained the situation clearly, stating the evidence of fraud, child abuse, and falsification of medical documents. Victoria's expression changed instantly when she heard him making the call. She stepped toward him, begging him to stop, but he ignored her. When he ended the call, he told her that the police were on their way. Victoria reacted with panic and anger, pacing around the room and insisting that everything was a misunderstanding. She tried to grab the documents, but Richard blocked her. There was nothing left she could do. Within minutes, the authorities arrived at the house. Richard led them into the room and handed over the evidence. Everything was now official. The truth could no longer be hidden. When the officers approached Victoria, she tried to resist, shouting that the accusations were false and that Margaret had planted everything. The officers remained calm, explaining the charges to her: fraud, child abuse, and falsification of medical records. Victoria continued shouting, but the officers restrained her and began escorting her out of the house. As she was led through the hallway, she turned her anger toward Margaret, shouting insults and blaming her for everything. Margaret stayed where she was, silent and composed. She did not respond or step back. She had expected this reaction, but she also knew that the truth had finally come out. Victoria's words no longer carried power. Everyone in the house understood who had been protecting Ethan and who had been harming him. Margaret watched as the door closed behind Victoria, knowing that the most dangerous person in the Hale family's life was finally gone. After Victoria was taken away, the house became quiet again, but the silence felt different. It was not filled with fear or tension anymore. Richard stood still for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. Eventually, he turned to Margaret with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he saw her clearly as the person who had stayed loyal, patient, and brave through every challenge. Margaret did not celebrate or show relief. She simply took a deep breath, grateful that Ethan was now safe. Richard thanked her, realizing how much she had risked and how alone she had been while fighting for the truth. It was the first step toward rebuilding trust in the household. Margaret knew there was still much work ahead. Healing for Richard, recovery for Ethan, and time for the entire family to regain stability. But for the first time in years, the path forward was clear. The danger was gone, and her courage had finally been recognized. After Victoria's arrest, the house entered a period of emotional recovery that was both necessary and long overdue. The atmosphere slowly shifted from tension and fear to something calmer and safer. Richard spent a great deal of time reflecting on everything that had happened, and he realized how deeply the situation had affected Ethan, Margaret, and even himself. The rooms that once felt heavy now seemed quieter, and the silence no longer carried the same sense of danger. Instead, it marked the start of a new chapter. Richard knew that the first step toward rebuilding their lives was making sure Ethan finally received the proper care he had been denied for so long. He took responsibility for the mistakes he had made, even if they were rooted in trust and vulnerability. Margaret continued with her duties in a steady and comforting way, helping keep the house running smoothly during this difficult transition. Richard's next action was to seek professional medical help for Ethan. He contacted reliable doctors and specialists who thoroughly examined the boy's condition. These professionals confirmed the earlier findings Margaret had uncovered. Ethan's visual impairment required gentle, careful treatment, not the harsh substances he had been given before. Under proper care, Ethan began to show signs of relief. The irritation in his eyes decreased, and he no longer cried in pain as he had during the false treatments. The change was gradual, but it was real and visible. Richard watched these improvements with a mixture of hope and regret. He felt guilty for having allowed the harmful treatment to continue for so long, but he also felt committed to doing everything right from that point on. Margaret supported him throughout the process, offering stability and reassurance as they adjusted to these new routines. One of the most important moments during this recovery period was when Richard approached Margaret to apologize. He spoke honestly, admitting that he had failed to listen to her when she tried to warn him. He explained that his emotional dependence on Victoria had clouded his judgment, and that he deeply regretted not recognizing Margaret's loyalty earlier. Margaret accepted his apology with calm understanding. She did not hold anger or resentment because she knew Richard had been manipulated and overwhelmed by grief. When Richard asked her to stay permanently in the household, not just as an employee, but as a key part of Ethan's life, she felt both honored and relieved. She had fought for the boy's safety, and now she would be able to help guide him without fear of interference. Their relationship, once strained, began to shift into something built on mutual respect. As time passed, a deeper bond formed between Richard and Margaret. It was not forced or rushed. It developed naturally through shared responsibility and trust. They supported each other during difficult moments and celebrated small victories in Ethan's progress. Richard grew comfortable, relying on Margaret in ways he had never allowed himself to before. Margaret, in turn, felt valued and appreciated not just for her work, but for her dedication and strength. Their connection became one of the most stable parts of the household. They learned to communicate openly and rely on each other without hesitation. This new dynamic created a steady foundation that helped the entire family move forward. Ethan, now protected and receiving proper care, found stability in this new environment. He responded positively to the consistent affection and gentle guidance he received from both Richard and Margaret. Even though his condition still required attention, he no longer lived in fear or discomfort. His days became calmer, filled with routines that made him feel secure. Richard and Margaret worked together to ensure he felt loved and supported, each playing an important role in his emotional recovery. Over time, Ethan began to show more confidence in his movements and reactions, proof that the peaceful environment had a meaningful impact on him. The household was no longer a place of stress, but a place where he could grow and heal. With Victoria gone, the emotional balance of the home shifted completely. The absence of manipulation, tension and fear brought a sense of peace that everyone in the house felt. Richard and Margaret rebuilt the daily routines with care, focusing on creating an atmosphere filled with affection and stability. Each day marked a small step toward emotional healing. Margaret continued caring for Ethan with devotion, and Richard worked hard to provide a secure future for his son. Together, they formed a strong support system, becoming pillars for one another. The pain of the past did not disappear overnight, but the family slowly learned to replace old fears with trust, warmth, and hope. For the first time in a long while, the Hale household felt like a true home, where every day offered a new chance to move forward and rebuild their lives. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.